Most people imagine collapse as an event, something loud, sudden, unmistakable, a moment that arrives with headlines, declarations, and visible rupture. History suggests otherwise. Collapse is rarely theatrical. It unfolds discreetly, almost politely, within the texture of ordinary life. It begins not with chaos, but with a quiet misalignment, a sense that familiar rules still function, yet no longer produce familiar outcomes. Earnings feel less substantial. Savings appear intact, yet inspire less confidence. Effort increases while certainty diminishes. Nothing has happened, and yet something has shifted. Those sensitive to such shifts often struggle to articulate them. Language lags behind perception, and so most people ignore the signal, choosing reassurance over interpretation. This is not foolishness, it is human. Throughout history, societies have reached moments where continuity was assumed precisely when adjustment was inevitable. Not because people lacked intelligence, but because stability encourages forgetfulness, and forgetfulness erodes judgment. The subject before us is not catastrophe. It is memory. Specifically, the memory of principles that have persisted across empires, currencies, ideologies, and social orders. Principles that do not promise prosperity, but ensure survival. Principles that do not depend on optimism, but function under pressure. If one were to strip away every modern abstraction, markets, platforms, instruments, assurances, and ask a single question, it would be this: what retains value when belief is no longer sufficient? That question has been answered repeatedly, in antiquity and in modernity, under monarchy and republic, through inflation, default, and institutional decay. The answers have been remarkably consistent. This consistency is unsettling, because it suggests that progress does not eliminate constraint. It merely disguises it. The Roman world offers a revealing starting point. At its height, Roman civilization was administratively sophisticated, militarily dominant, and economically integrated across vast distances. Its currency circulated widely. Its institutions appeared durable. And yet, beneath this surface, a familiar pattern emerged. Expenditure exceeded capacity. Debasement replaced discipline. Confidence substituted for margin. Silver content in coinage declined gradually, almost imperceptibly. Trade continued. Life appeared normal until prices rose, savings eroded, and trust, once broken, proved impossible to restore. Rome did not fall because people panicked. It fell because they adapted too slowly. The same pattern resurfaced centuries later, under entirely different conditions. In early 20th century Europe, monetary expansion was justified as necessity. War debts required accommodation. Reconstruction demanded flexibility. Again, the process began quietly. Again, stability appeared intact. Again, adjustment arrived not as reform, but as rupture. The lesson here is not historical trivia. It is structural. When systems rely increasingly on belief rather than buffer, they become vulnerable to reality. Reality is patient. It does not negotiate. It asserts itself eventually. Modern societies often imagine themselves exempt from this logic. They are not. No civilization is. The present era is distinguished not by immunity, but by complexity. Layers of finance, policy, and abstraction interlock so tightly that fragility becomes difficult to perceive. Stability appears engineered. Risk appears distributed. But distribution is not elimination. It is merely delay. This brings us to the central misunderstanding of modern financial thinking. That intelligence can substitute for structure. That cleverness can overcome constraint. That innovation abolishes limits. History refutes this repeatedly. Innovation rearranges limits. It does not erase them, which is why principles, not strategies, matter most. Strategies depend on context. Principles operate regardless of it. A strategy might advise investment in equities. A principle asks whether ownership is real or conditional. A strategy may favor leverage for efficiency. A principle asks what happens when income falters. A strategy assumes enforceable contracts. A principle asks who enforces them when institutions strain. The difference is subtle but decisive. Nowhere is this clearer than in the distinction between tangible reality and paper promise. Throughout history, assets grounded in physical utility have outlived those grounded in abstraction. Land that produces sustenance retains relevance when currency falters. Tools retain function when markets freeze. Shelter retains value regardless of price. Paper claims, however sophisticated, depend upon enforcement. Enforcement depends upon stability. Stability is never guaranteed. This is not romantic nostalgia. It is empirical observation. In every systemic adjustment, from antiquity to modernity, paper wealth has proven fragile. Not because it is immoral, but because it is conditional. Conditional upon trust. Conditional upon solvency. Conditional upon continuity. When any of these weaken, claims unravel. Reality does not. A field yields crops regardless of monetary policy. A skill resolves problems regardless of exchange rates. A trusted relationship functions without formal arbitration. These truths are unfashionable. They lack spectacle. They do not scale elegantly, which is precisely why they endure. The first principle, therefore, is not complicated. Reality survives when abstraction fails. Those who anchor themselves to reality through ownership, capability, and access outlast those who rely on promises. The second principle follows naturally. Not all assets are equal, even when tangible. There is a distinction between assets that merely store value and those that generate it. Throughout periods of instability, productive assets have always outperformed speculative ones. Speculation depends on expectation. Production depends on necessity. When expectation dissolves, speculation collapses. Necessity remains. Agricultural land, essential housing, local enterprise? These persist because they answer enduring needs. Speculative instruments, by contrast, rely on future belief. Belief is volatile. This is not an argument against ambition. It is an argument against dependency. History favors those whose survival does not require consensus. Which leads us, inevitably, to debt. Debt is the most misunderstood force in times of transition. In stable conditions, it appears rational, efficient, even virtuous. It accelerates growth. It smooths consumption. It multiplies opportunity. Under strain, it becomes merciless. Debt is a claim on future certainty. Collapse withdraws certainty. The result is predictable. Throughout history, those encumbered by debt lost autonomy first. Foreclosure, confiscation, forced conversion. These are not aberrations. They are mechanisms. Debt does not negotiate. It enforces. Those who own assets outright possess optionality. Those who own them conditionally do not. This difference determines survival more often than intelligence or effort. The first phase of every collapse rewards those without obligation, not because they are wealthier, but because they are flexible. Flexibility is the most underrated form of strength. The uncomfortable implication of all this is that modern success often cultivates fragility. Efficiency eliminates redundancy. Optimization reduces margin. Leverage magnifies exposure. These features are celebrated in growth phases. They are punished in adjustment. History does not care about intention. It responds to structure. In the next part, we will move beyond assets and balance sheets, toward the elements that persist even when ownership fails. Skills, trust, position within community, and why, in every collapse, those who endure are not those with the most, but those with the fewest dependencies. If the first principles concern what endures materially, the next concern what endures socially, because no collapse is navigated alone. And no amount of private foresight compensates for complete social isolation. History is unequivocal on this point. When formal systems weaken, informal structures reassert themselves. Not out of sentiment, out of necessity. Every civilization that endured periods of contraction relied not on institutions, but on proximity, on relationships that preceded contracts, on obligations that existed before enforcement. This is where modern thinking encounters discomfort. We have been trained to believe that systems replace people, that scale replaces trust, that abstraction replaces familiarity. For a time, this belief appears justified. Institutions grow, processes automate, interactions become efficient, frictionless, anonymous. And then pressure arrives. Suddenly, efficiency reveals itself as fragility, because efficiency removes redundancy. And redundancy is what absorbs shock. In every collapse, trust migrates downward. From centralized authority to local presence. From documentation to reputation. From policy to person. This is not regression, it is reversion. A return to the most ancient mechanism of human coordination. Trust. Trust is often dismissed as sentimental. In truth, it is structural. It determines who is helped first, who is warned early, who is extended credit when credit no longer exists. During the Great Depression, families with strong community ties fared better. Not because they were wealthier, but because they were known. Known people are harder to discard. The same pattern emerged during financial crises across continents. Formal employment vanished. Informal cooperation replaced it. Those embedded in networks adapted. Those isolated suffered disproportionately. This reality is deeply uncomfortable for modern individualism. It suggests that autonomy is not absolute, that independence without connection is exposure, and that dignity in times of stress is preserved not through self-sufficiency alone, but through mutual recognition. Which leads us to the fourth enduring principle. Skills outlast currency. This is not an abstraction. It is one of the most consistent observations across periods of monetary disruption. When currency weakens, pricing becomes unstable. Contracts lose clarity. Savings dissolve. What remains is need. And need is indifferent to ideology. A leaking roof still requires repair. Illness still demands care. Food still must be grown, prepared, and distributed. Skills that address these realities retain value regardless of denomination. Throughout history, individuals with portable, practical competence have maintained agency. They did not need permission to operate. They did not require institutional validation. They could exchange effort directly for sustenance. This does not imply that intellectual or abstract skills are worthless. It implies that dependence is costly. The more a skill relies on uninterrupted systems, energy grids, platforms, capital flows, the more fragile its value becomes under strain. By contrast, skills grounded in physical reality translate across contexts. They scale down when systems scale back. This adaptability is not glamorous. It does not produce rapid accumulation, but it preserves relevance. And relevance is survival. Modern societies tend to undervalue this form of capital. They prioritize specialization over versatility, credential over competence, recognition over contribution. In periods of expansion, this preference is rewarded. In periods of adjustment, it is reversed. Collapse does not ask who you were. It asks what you can do now. This question is unsettling. It strips away status. It ignores resume. It is brutally honest. Those who answer it honestly adapt. Those who insist on past identity suffer. This is why collapse is experienced not merely as loss, but as humiliation. Not because dignity is destroyed, but because it was outsourced. Which brings us to the final social principle. Institutions fail quietly. Relationships do not. Institutions communicate through policy. Relationships communicate through presence. When systems strain, policy becomes ambiguous. Presence becomes decisive. Who shows up? Who shares? Who warns? Who cooperates? These behaviors cannot be legislated. They must exist beforehand. This is why social capital must be cultivated in advance, not strategically. Organically. Collapse punishes transactional relationships. It rewards reciprocal ones. Those who view connection solely as utility find themselves exposed. Those who invest in continuity find support. This principle extends beyond immediate survival. It shapes recovery. After every collapse, reconstruction begins locally, not centrally. Markets reform where trust exists. Trade resumes where reputation is intact. Stability reemerges not through decree, but through repeated interaction. History rarely records these processes. They are too small, too quiet, too human, and yet they determine outcomes more reliably than any macroeconomic intervention. At this point, a pattern should be clear. What endures is not what scales fastest. It is what degrades slowest. Hard assets, productive capability, debt-free ownership, portable skills, trust-based relationships. These are not investment strategies. They are positions. Positions that do not require prediction. They require restraint. This restraint is often mistaken for pessimism. In truth, it is respect. Respect for uncertainty. Respect for history. Respect for limits. Those who possess this respect do not seek to outpace systems. They seek to remain standing when systems adjust. Which brings us to the most difficult terrain of all, the internal landscape. Because collapse does not only rearrange resources, it rearranges meaning. In the next part, we will examine the psychological dimension of systemic transition. Why intelligent people freeze, why confidence becomes dangerous, why humility becomes strength, and why the greatest asset in times of uncertainty is not foresight, but clarity of self. There comes a point in every systemic transition when the external world becomes less decisive than the internal one. Not because material conditions no longer matter, but because interpretation begins to shape outcome more powerfully than circumstance itself. History records collapses as economic phenomena. Those who lived through them remember something else entirely. They remember confusion, the disintegration of meaning, the slow, unsettling realization that the rules which once governed effort, reward, and dignity no longer applied. This is where collapse reveals its most profound effect. It is not the loss of wealth. It is the erosion of orientation. Modern societies cultivate identities that are deeply entangled with systems. Occupation becomes self-definition. Income becomes moral proof. Recognition becomes validation of existence. In times of stability, this fusion feels seamless. In times of transition, it becomes perilous. Because when systems falter, identities anchored to them fracture. History shows this pattern with brutal consistency. During periods of monetary collapse, the most visible suffering often belonged not to the poor, but to the respectable. Those who had followed every rule. Those who had trusted credentials, institutions, and progression. They were not unprepared materially. They were unprepared psychologically. The system did not merely fail them. It invalidated the narrative through which they understood themselves. This is why collapse paralyzes the educated more often than the resilient. Not because education lacks value, but because modern education rarely teaches detachment. It teaches optimization within a framework. When the framework dissolves, optimization becomes meaningless. Those who adapt are not necessarily tougher. They are more flexible in identity. They do not confuse dignity with position. They do not confuse worth with recognition. They retain a sense of self that precedes external affirmation. This distinction is subtle, but decisive. Collapse does not strip dignity. It exposes where dignity was stored. If dignity resided in title, it evaporates. If dignity resided in contribution, it persists. This is why, historically, collapse reorders social hierarchies, not ideologically, functionally. Those who meet needs rise in relevance. Those who once commanded deference without necessity fade. This reordering feels unjust only to those who believed status was permanent. In reality, status has always been conditional. It is maintained by systems. When systems adjust, status adjusts with them. The psychological danger lies in resistance, in clinging to identities designed for conditions that no longer exist. This resistance manifests as bitterness, as denial, as resentment toward change rather than engagement with it. History is unforgiving towards such resistance, not out of cruelty, out of indifference. Systems do not negotiate with nostalgia. They respond to function. Those who accept this early preserve agency. Those who resist surrender it. Agency is the quiet prize of collapse, not control, choice. The ability to decide how one responds rather than merely react. This is why humility emerges repeatedly as the decisive trait in historical transitions. Humility is often misunderstood as weakness. In truth, it is accuracy. An accurate assessment of one's position. An accurate understanding of one's dependence. An accurate reading of one's capacity. Those who approach uncertainty with humility remain adaptable. Those who approach it with entitlement shatter. Modern culture celebrates confidence, but confidence untethered from reality is dangerous. History punishes confidence more severely than fear. Fear, when examined, refines judgment. Confidence, when unquestioned, blinds it. This does not suggest retreat into passivity. On the contrary, it suggests disciplined engagement. Engagement without illusion. Engagement without dependency on outcome. This posture allows one to act without desperation. Desperation is the true enemy in collapse. Desperation narrows vision. It accelerates error. It trades long-term coherence for short-term relief. Those who remain composed do not necessarily suffer less, but they suffer meaningfully. They adjust without surrendering self-respect. They preserve internal continuity even when external continuity fractures. This internal continuity is the least discussed form of wealth. It cannot be quantified. It cannot be confiscated. It cannot be inflated away. And yet, it determines whether one emerges diminished or intact. Collapse also reveals a second psychological trap. The belief that crisis brings clarity? It does not. Crisis multiplies noise, contradictory information, false authorities, simplistic narratives. Those who seek certainty become vulnerable to manipulation. Those who tolerate ambiguity retain independence. Historically, the most dangerous voices during collapse are not the pessimists, they are the absolutists. Those who claim certainty. Those who promise resolution. Those who offer simple explanations for complex failure. Such voices thrive on fear, and fear, when externalized, becomes controllable. This is why internal clarity matters more than external reassurance. Clarity about values. Clarity about limits. Clarity about what one will not sacrifice to maintain comfort. These internal boundaries preserve dignity under pressure. They prevent moral erosion in pursuit of stability. History is filled with examples of material survival accompanied by ethical collapse. Such survival is hollow. Those who endure with integrity do so because they prepared internally as much as externally. They accepted uncertainty. They relinquished entitlement. They cultivated adaptability without abandoning principle. This balance is rare, but it is learnable. And it is the true dividing line between those who merely survive and those who endure. As systems tighten, individuals face an implicit choice: to outsource meaning to outcomes, or to root it in conduct. Those who choose the latter remain psychologically sovereign. Those who choose the former become reactive. This sovereignty is not defiance. It is composure. Composure allows one to see clearly when others rush, to move deliberately when others panic, to conserve energy when others exhaust themselves. Composure is not indifference. It is disciplined attention. This is why the most resilient individuals in history were rarely loud. They did not seek to dominate narrative. They sought to remain coherent. Coherence is stability. Internal stability precedes external adaptation. Without it, every adjustment feels like loss. With it, adjustment becomes movement. In the final part, we will draw these threads together, not into prescriptions, not into warnings, but into orientation. What it means to live intelligently within uncertainty. How to relate to systems without surrendering self. And why, in periods of transition, the quiet discipline of thought becomes one of the most powerful forms of capital available. Every serious reflection must eventually arrive not at an answer, but at a posture, a way of standing within uncertainty. What history teaches most reliably is not how to avoid transition, but how to inhabit it without surrendering oneself to fear, illusion, or resentment. The systems we construct are never eternal. They are provisional agreements between complexity and confidence. For long periods, these agreements hold. They reward participation. They validate identity. They convert effort into outcome with reassuring consistency. And then, gradually, they demand more than they can deliver. At that point, adjustment becomes unavoidable. Not dramatic adjustment, subtle adjustment. The kind that reveals itself through diminishing returns, tightening margins, and an unspoken sense that expectations must be revised. This is the phase we now recognize so often in hindsight. The phase in which most people continue as before, not because they are foolish, but because continuity is comforting. History does not condemn this instinct. It simply outpaces it. Those who endure periods of transition do not do so by rejecting systems. They do so by seeing them clearly, by understanding where systems provide structure and where they impose dependency, by recognizing that participation need not require belief, and that loyalty to reality must supersede loyalty to narrative. The principles we have explored are not strategies for advantage. They are disciplines of orientation. They teach one how to remain standing when assumptions loosen, how to preserve flexibility when certainty fades, how to maintain dignity when status becomes unstable. Hard assets endure because they answer to necessity rather than opinion. Productive capacity survives because need does not disappear. Freedom from excessive obligation preserves optionality when enforcement tightens. Skills retain relevance because problems persist regardless of policy. Trust networks function because proximity outperforms abstraction under pressure. These are not heroic insights. They are quiet recognitions. Recognitions that civilization advances not by abolishing constraint, but by managing it intelligently. What distinguishes the composed individual during transition is not foresight. It is restraint. The restraint to avoid urgency. The restraint to resist false certainty. The restraint to act deliberately rather than react reflexively. Urgency is how systems extract compliance when confidence wavers. Those who remain calm retain choice. Choice, in such moments, becomes the rarest form of freedom. This freedom is internal before it is external. It arises from clarity rather than optimism, from acceptance rather than denial, from humility rather than entitlement. Humility, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is not submission. It is alignment with reality, and alignment confers strength. Those aligned with reality adjust early. They do not demand guarantees. They do not wait for permission. They do not confuse hope with preparation. They move quietly, often invisibly, preserving coherence while others seek reassurance. Such individuals rarely appear triumphant. They simply remain intact, and remaining intact when systems strain is no small achievement. It is tempting to believe that transition rewards those who predict correctly. History offers little support for this belief. Predictions fail because systems are complex. What endures is preparedness. Preparedness does not require knowing what will happen. It requires knowing what matters. What matters does not change often. The means change. The instruments evolve. The language adapts, but the foundations remain. Food, shelter, capability, trust, integrity. These are the constants beneath every economic narrative. Those who organize their lives around these constants do not fear adjustment. They respect it. Respect does not imply passivity. It implies attentiveness, an attentiveness to signals rather than noise, to behavior rather than rhetoric, to structure rather than spectacle. In an age saturated with information, this attentiveness is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. If this reflection has offered you something, not certainty, but orientation, then it has served its purpose. Orientation does not tell you where to go. It tells you where you are, and knowing where you are is the prerequisite for any meaningful movement. Thoughtful engagement with such ideas is not an act of agreement. It is an act of seriousness, a recognition that depth still matters, that slow thinking still has relevance, that history, when approached without sentimentality, remains one of the most practical guides available. If you find value in this kind of inquiry, continuing the conversation is a natural extension. Not as endorsement, but as alignment. A considered response, one shaped by reflection rather than impulse, contributes something increasingly scarce, signal amid noise. And if there is someone in your life whose mind you respect, whose conversation sharpens rather than simplifies, this is precisely the kind of material worth sharing with them. Not to persuade, but to think alongside one another. Because the future does not belong to those who speak most confidently about it. It belongs to those who remain clear while it unfolds. Thank you for lending this reflection your attention. In times defined by acceleration and distraction, sustained thought is already a quiet form of independence.